So this is the month of October, and in October, we know usually people will celebrate harvest and different things like festivities, or they'll go out. Well, anyway, this month is quite a month because one thing I can say is that it is never ever been a year that the names of serial killers have not been mentioned. They've always been mentioned, and to my knowledge, it seems as though now they become popularized in theme parks and in books and in movies. And but what I do know, this month they have been playing Dahmer, Jeffrey Dahmer. They've been playing a lot of different serial killers, but Jeffrey Dahmer in particular. And so Netflix has a series of Jeffrey Dahmer, and I've seen other movies that have depicted either his life or the killings, but never the victims, who they might have been. And so in the Netflix series, they give you more of an insight of who the victims were, their families, so you can get to see what the people may have been like before they became what we know now as, people who now are not alive because they fell victim to a predator who had a really evil intention to just do horrible crimes to those whom, if you watch the series or if you know anything about this person, you know that these crimes were not just, how would you say, they were not your average crime. It was more like what you would think would be for the month of October, or any horror movie that you would put this character in and exaggerate the character, which I believe that's what's been done with the serial killers, especially here in America. The most infamous and the most horrible people that you could think of what their crimes were, it usually winds up being Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Ed Gein, and Charles Manson. That's just to name a few of the main characters that they bring up, and they become popularized in American culture in terms of horror movies, and they've been also exaggerated. And like the Texas, a lot of people don't realize the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was not just a movie, it actually was based off a true story. And so a lot of these serial killers were not just movie characters. They actually existed at one time. And believe you me, there are people that still remember. It wasn't that long ago. At least to me, it doesn't feel that way. But to those that are like just learning of this, or maybe they were too young to even understand, these characters were really not something that you would be celebrating at all. And I really, to be honest, in my own true feelings, I don't think they should be celebrated. However, I do believe that the victims, or the people who fell victim to these people, should be recognized, and they should be remembered. And you should look at their lives more than the killer's life. And I know that some of the movies, they have different angles of, what they want you to see. If you want to see the life of the murderer, it seems like most of them that I've seen always will show the killer, the life of the killer, why they became who they were, but you never see who the victims were, what their lives were, or what they could have been. And so I think in this particular Netflix series, it does show the lives of the people who were victims, just some of the victims of Dahmer, and the lives of the family and what their feelings were and their reaction to what people see them as comic book characters or, movie monsters, that these people actually were real people and they existed and they were not something you would want to read about in a comic book or you'd want even to be, around for fear that they could be out there doing the same thing again or worse. However, I don't know why this happens, even with some of the people you hear about today who have been involved in like mass shootings, where all of a sudden they have this fan base. They have people sending them cards and letters. They're fascinated with murder or killing, or maybe something is wrong with those individuals. I don't know what it is, but you'll have a strange group of people who will find these individuals fascinating, like with the Night Stalker. There were women, I believe a woman, she actually married him while he was incarcerated, and she was like a fan of his. So it's just like some of the shooters, they're getting like mail, they're getting like fan base mail, mail from girls, guys who look up to them. It's I heard that Charles Manson had like a group of people who were still following him before his death. So it's not unusual that these things are happening even now. And so with this article, it's just gonna validate what I've been saying. So I thought this was outrageous, to see that the actual Dahmer glasses, the glasses that the actual serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer wore in prison, have went up for sale for $150,000 US. And so this article was by Sophie Caraan. Caraan. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Sorry if I didn't say your name correctly. Caraan. Okay, so I saw this article and I had posted it on Twitter because I was like, oh my God, there are still people that are fascinated over Jeffrey Dahmer. So the eyeglasses that the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer wore in prison is going up for sale for $150,000 USD or US dollars. And so the item is being sold by a Taylor James of Occult Collectibles in Vancouver, Canada, who claims that he acquired the glasses and several other items of the Milwaukee cannibal from the former housekeeper of Dahmer's father, Lionel. The collection, which also includes Dahmer's cutlery, Bible, family photos, several of his paperwork, is now being managed and sold by James for a portion of the profits. So this is happening. Even TMZ reports that although the website does not feature the glasses, those who are interested can contact Taylor directly. So Jeffrey Dahmer became a fixture in pop culture once again due to Ryan Murphy's Monster Netflix series. Okay, so this stars in Evan Peters as the notorious serial killer. So that's who you see the picture of. That's not the Jeffrey Dahmer, but that's an actor who has the likeness of him. He's the in the series the serial killer. So despite the renewed interest, however, many have reacted negatively to the show. So rapper Boosie Badazz tweeted about how black people should boycott Monster because what he did to our black kids is effing sick. Okay? Oh, okay, so are fucking sick, basically. Sorry for but while Rita Isbell, the sister of Errol Lindsey, a 19-year-old victim of Dahmer, criticized Netflix for failing to reach out to the victims' families and accused the streamer of making money off this tragedy. So this is how the families even today still feel. They haven't been really contacted about this whole thing. So it's a constant reliving of the tragedy. What I'll say is they do highlight the victims in this series, but by them not contacting the actual people is probably not a good look either. So I will say that. So when I saw some of the show, it bothered me, especially when I saw myself, when I saw my name come across the screen and this lady saying verbatim exactly what I said. And so if I didn't know any better, I would have thought it was me. Her hair was like mine and she had on the same clothes. That's why I felt like reliving it all over again. It felt like she relived it all over again. It brought me back to all those emotions that I was feeling back then. I was never contacted about the show, but I feel like Netflix should have asked if we mind or how we felt about making it. So they didn't ask me anything and they just did it. But I'm not money hungry, and that's what this show is about. Netflix trying to get paid. So Dahmer, this is basically going to tell you what this serial killer, a little bit of the rundown of him if you haven't already known. So Jeffrey Dahmer, he murdered and dismembered a total of 17 men and boys. This was between the years of 1978 and 1991, most of whom were black or they were brown. Monster explores the killings of his victims and how both homophobia, Dahmer was a gay man, and racism enabled him to commit the crimes for years. So elsewhere in entertainment, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I guess this article was really short. It wasn't really long, so there's a slew of comments about this series. Okay, so now, attached to it, however, what happened to Jeffrey Dahmer's grandmother, Catherine Jemima Hughes? Jeffrey Dahmer lived with his grandmother, Catherine Jemima Hughes, and used her basement to store his victims' bodies. Here, we explain what happened to her. So that's what this one article is about. Then there's another article that says, here's why people think Dean Vaughn may have been a Dahmer victim as well. So, and then they say, here's what happened to Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment of horrors after he was arrested. Okay, so let's find out what happened to his apartment. What happened to Jeffrey Dahmer's neighbor, Glenda Cleveland? So there's a lot of what ifs. What happened to this character or this actual person? So here's what happened to Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment of horrors after he was arrested. This is by Chase Sanders, okay? And so this article came out as well. So all this is related to this particular serial killer who at once actually existed. So notorious American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer claimed the lives of 17 victims between the years of 1978 and 1991. Due to the police negligence and their failure to believe the neighbors' complaints of suspicious behavior, Dahmer was able to commit his heinous crimes over a decade long. So now, with the new Netflix miniseries called Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story becoming a popular show for true crime junkies and a curious audience, people are left wondering what happened to Dahmer after his arrest. Well, long story short, he was murdered by an inmate in prison while serving a 15 consecutive life term sentence. Okay, and so it goes on to say, but whatever happened to his apartment where a majority of his gruesome crimes took place? So here's what we know about his horror-filled apartment at 925 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So Jeffrey Dahmer moved into his apartment 213 of the Oxford Apartments after living with his grandmother, where she had no knowledge of the crimes that he was committing under her roof, in what New York Times described as a killing factory. So Jeffrey Dahmer claimed the lives of 11 victims here and kept a barrel of acid in the corner of his room. We'll save you from hearing those grisly details. Okay, or grisly details, that is. And it says, what does Dahmer's apartment look like now? So after Tracy Edwards escaped Dahmer's apartment, he was able to flag down the police and lead them back to the apartment, where he found the disturbing Polaroids of previous victims and a giant barrel of acid that should have caused suspicion in the first place. The skeleton remains also. And Dahmer was arrested July the 22nd of 1991. So within about 15 months of his arrest, the Oxford Apartments was demolished. So a collaborative neighborhood redevelopment initiative called the Campus Circle Project purchased a lot in 1995, but there's not much to report since nothing really came out of it. However, they did help the building's residents find new places to live, according to the tab. Okay. So the people who were previously living there have found other places to stay, of course, since then. But there was supposedly plans to transform the site into a memorial garden, playground, and new housing as well. As of now, the lot that used to hold Dahmer's apartment remains vacant till this day. So as you can probably imagine, there's not much interest from anyone to deal with the tainted property. So on Google Maps, you can see that it's just a grassy field with apartments standing a few feet from the old site. So that's what happened with that place. And so going back to, this is sort of like this character here, and his glasses going up for sale, and so it just never ends with this person. It's like, even though he did all this horrible stuff and he's not here with us anymore, they just won't let it go in terms of, this character. So it goes on, it talks about Jeffrey Dahmer killed 3 people in his grandma's basement. Jeffrey Dahmer's family moved him in with a grandmother, Catherine, and killed 3 men in her. He killed 3 men in the basement, all about Catherine, her husband Herbert, and her life. So there's things about their lives, okay? And so how about the life of the woman Glenda Cleveland? What happened to her? The lady that portrayed her was Niecy Nash in the Netflix series Monster. So what happened to Jeffrey's neighbor, Glenda Cleveland? Okay, so this is all too often, even till this day, this still happens, where people will complain, and if they happen to be people a lot of times of color, and they're complaining about some suspicious activity, a lot of times it doesn't get taken serious. especially coming in from neighborhoods that are low income or neighborhoods that are primarily African American or brown or black and brown neighborhoods where it's sort of swept under the rug or ignored. So this is by Leah Campano. So what happened to Jeffrey Dahmer's neighbor, Glenda Cleveland? So this is Niecy Nash. She played the neighbor who lived right next to Dahmer. So it says content warning, the article contains discussions of murder, suicide, sexual assault, and some may find it upsetting. So there is reader discretion advised in this. All right, so that's a disclaimer. Okay, so this is sort of with going in line with the series. So the content warning basically is telling you the Netflix newest crime series Monster, Jeffrey Dahmer's story is a haunting retelling of the life and crime of one of America's most notorious serial killers between the years of 1978 and 1991. Dahmer had murdered and dismembered the bodies of 17 young boys and men, mostly in and around his apartment in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so the series has led to many questions about the people Dahmer knew, including his neighbor Glenda Cleveland. So Cleveland, who is portrayed by Niecy Nash in Monster, heroically tried to stop Dahmer 2 months before he was finally arrested. So as depicted in the series, she called the police after she encountered one of Dahmer's victims, a 14-year-old Conrad Smafone. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but in May of 1991, there was a young 14-year-old boy who Dahmer had basically murdered. She found him outside. He was drugged, he was unclothed, he was gravely disoriented. But when the authorities arrived, they brought the young boy back to Dahmer's apartment. And so while some of the scenes of Cleveland are based in fact, like the above, others have been fictionalized for the show, of course. So here's everything we need to know about Dahmer's neighbor, Glenda Cleveland. She didn't actually live next door to Dahmer, exactly next door to Dahmer. In the series, Cleveland lives in a unit right next door to Dahmer, but she's seen repeatedly suspicious Dahmer's behavior and smells coming from the apartment and his use of power tools late at night. But in the real life story, Cleveland lived in a building adjacent to Dahmer, according to USA Today. So it's believed that her character in Monster is based in part on Pamela Bass, a woman who actually lived next door to Dahmer in the Oxford apartments, according to Milwaukee Journal Centennial. And so it is Bass who Dahmer offered the sandwiches to. So I have probably eaten somebody's body part, Bass says in Jeffrey Dahmer's File documentary. Cleveland continued to call the authorities after finding one of Dahmer's victims. And so she continued calling the police, and Cleveland's daughter, Sandra Smith, and the niece, Nicole Childress, saw the 14-year-old Conrad, and I can't pronounce his last name, trying to escape Dahmer's apartment building in May of 1991. So Glenda Cleveland, she called the police, but he was returned to Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment when they arrived. So she continued to call the authorities anyway, and that night to check that the young boy was okay. And so according to USA Today, after she discovered the missing person sign of Conrad, she repeatedly called the police, even the FBI, but no one ever had answered her. So Dahmer killed 5 more victims after Cleveland had attempted to call police and authorities to alert the authorities of what was going on. So she died. The actual woman, Glenda Cleveland, she died in December of 2011. So the 56-year-old, she died of natural causes, according to USA Today. So that was the woman who actually tried to help the 14-year-old boy. So it's sad. So Reverend Jesse Jackson, he met Cleveland following Dahmer's arrest. So police chose the word of a killer over an innocent woman. And he said at the time, per USA Today, so Cleveland was also honored by the local Common Council and County Board and was named a model citizen by the mayor, John Norquist. So Milwaukee Police Department and local women's, what does it say? No, local women's groups awarded her with a plaque and recognition as well for her bravery, trying to help, because that is very scary, I mean, most people would be afraid, they already kind of know somebody's out there doing this killing, and if you get suspicious, some people don't want to say anything. They're afraid that they could become the next victim, but he had a particular pattern, but you never know what people's mindset are. So Glenda was one of his victims too. So Niecy Nash said in an interview with Netflix, and her story has been told at least of told the least of these. So heavy is the head that wears the crown to tell the story, and specifically through Glenda's lenses, as it had never been done before. So she deserved way more than a little cheesy plaque in the bottom of a social hall somewhere, Niecy added. She deserved way more than the police step in front of her and say, look what we did, look what we tried to do. So that's pretty much that article right there. It is kind of sad when you think about it, but Niecy Nash, she did really play the character really well. It makes you feel as though you're like right there in the time that it happened, but it's very sad because I remember when this was going on. So I was around old enough to understand what this person was doing to these people. So it was very scary. He's not the only one that I remember or recall that was a serial killer that some of the kids now look at as like a costume. They actually were people that lived, and they actually were, people you did not want to come in contact with because you knew that, that these people have some serious issues, mental issues, or as they used to call it, the criminally insane. In Ed Gein's case, I believe that's what they called him, is criminally insane. There were others as well, that where they had either women were their victims, or there were men that were victims, young boys that were victims, or there was always a pattern with the serial killer. It was something about who they were or what they engaged in, in their life. Specifically with Dahmer, he's gay, and he was going to gay clubs, and that's also, he was attracted to, it seems like, black and brown men, primarily black men, and that's who he seemed to be drawn to. And I feel like the reason why they ignored a lot of it as well is because of the victims and because of the situation, because they're gay and they're black or they're brown or they're in a low income environment neighborhood, and the people who were doing the phone calling, most of them were black people who were trying to alert the authorities. about this particular white man that was in the community, where he stuck out like a sore thumb. You're like, well, why is he over in this neighborhood? He picked that area because he knows the police is not going to do anything. They're not checking for anybody over there. So he already knew, from the racism that they're not going to come over here and do anything to me, and by him being white, he knew that they would give him one of his victims back, and they wouldn't question him twice. What are you doing with this young guy? Had it have been, someone else that wasn't white and they looked like they might have fit in description, they may have dug a little deeper because of that fact. And so you can see there was a lot going on here. And then by the whole situation, it being gay, it wasn't like how now, you might find people that are more open about who they are, their personal preference of who they date and what their life is like. Then, it wasn't as open with everyone. Everyone wasn't as willing to share their life of who they have a date with or who they're mating with. Not everyone, of course. It was a little more non-inclusive. Is a better word, I guess, to say, but I'm thinking that had a lot to do with why they didn't put it as a priority situation to check to see who's doing these killings, and by the victims being, and most of them being black, and then then you throw the gay in there. I think it's a recipe for racism and discrimination all together in one full swoop. So you also have other serial killers that are out there. They preyed upon women, or they preyed upon a certain group of women. I've even heard people say things about, if they were street women, they shouldn't have been on the street, but they were still victims. That doesn't justify the killings, And so I think there was the son of Sam. There was a serial killer that was coined that name in there. There were other ones that they have in movies, in books, and some I don't know if some still are even alive. Some may be, if they are, they're really old. So it's just really disturbing that, getting back to where I was, that somebody would want to purchase the glasses, and there are people that do the collecting of. In the movie, they said they had all his stuff from his apartment and they were trashing it. Apparently, they didn't do a good job, did they? Anytime somebody they've still got the glasses of Dahmer, and they want to put them up for auction or for sale for $150,000. Wow, that's crazy. But I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all that is happening. It's not a surprise. So don't be surprised what you might see this month. Because lately, I don't know what it is about Jeffrey Dahmer, but they're bringing him up a lot. I don't know if maybe the family members are coming out and they're speaking, or if maybe there's something going on that has caused more people to take notice of the crimes that have happened, to the fact that they highlight, and I mentioned this, silence is violence. Here you had a group of people who were living in an apartment building, and they were people of color, and they were trying to ask for help from the authorities. And so this is a great example as to why there's a broken down trust issues with the black and brown community in terms of policing. When you have situations like what happened here you had this guy, he went on to, like, what it did say, I think for a decade, he went on to continue killing. It sounded like two decades, 3 decades. He went on to continue killing his victims, and they just totally ignored the black people that were living in the community that had trusted law enforcement to protect and serve. And that was not protecting and serving, was it? It was the total opposite. And this guy, he basically, even though he knew he had, where his privilege came in is that he was white, and he knew that the police would take his word over the black residents. They had to be the ones that were crazy. They didn't know what they were talking about, and oftentimes that's how we're treated. Like, we're crazy, we're just making it up, it's a conspiracy, or we're on drugs, we're the ones that got the issues. But they never would have suspected him, because he looks like he's clean, and he's white, and he just happens to live in the neighborhood. He's not a troublemaker. He pays his rent on time. That's what they were saying in the character, the landlord in the Netflix series. He says, "Oh, he's Mr. Dahmer. He's no trouble. He pays his rent on time." I noticed that was the main thing he mentioned. He pays his rent on time. And so, he's white, he's right, and he can't be wrong. That's basically the way they treated him, and that's why they just basically took one of the victims that they could have saved his life and to put him right back in the hands of this maniac. And he dismembered him, he killed him. And they trusted the maniac over citizens, people who lived in the community, were saying, "We smell funny smells coming from his apartment. Why don't you guys go in there and check it out?" And so how many times I've seen this, even when I was growing up, I would see black people would call the police, and they would ask the police for help for something, and they wouldn't listen. And so people just gave up. They stopped doing it, And usually when they do come, it's when the damage is already done. And isn't this the same thing? It's the same exact thing. It's the same thing. It's after everybody's been murdered, or there's been some tragedy, and then here they come. "Oh, now we believe you. It's too late now. When we were warning you before it got out of control, and we were asking you for help. But then when we asked you, you just swept it under the rug, or you didn't take us serious, So that's the reason why it's things like these, situations like these, that cause people to have a lack of trust for authority figures, because they already know racism is going to play a huge part in this. They know that you're going to look at them as being the criminal. Even if you look at the series, you see where one of the victims tried to flag down the police. Instead of the police looking at him as a victim, because he was a black man, they told him, "Get on the ground, put your hands up, and we want to know what you're talking about, blah, 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 blah." It took him a while to get them to see what he was talking about. And finally, they finally came around, but he had to be frisked, or looked at like he was the criminal. Right away, he must be the one. Why is he running down the street with no shirt on, and what's up with him? But he can't be the victim. So they didn't know until he had to do some doing to get them to come back. And then I think it was the complaints. Finally, they got so many complaints about the same person from different individuals that they finally decided, let's go take a look at it. It was when one of the officers looked at the Polaroid pictures that he discovered, yeah, we can't ignore this one right here, because he was taking pictures of the gruesome details of what he was doing to his victims. So, I mean, this guy, he was eating their bodies, he was cooking their bodies, he was breaking their bodies down. He said he had worked as a butcher in a butcher place at one time, so he knew how to dismember the bodies. And the acid he had was to try to whittle, I guess, like to whittle their bodies down to where it was like powder or something, or where they could not be recognized or identified. But he had bones, he kept trophies, he kept like their IDs, their watches, whatever emblems, things that they had. You know, serial killers have a thing where they keep trophies, and their trophies are of their victims, and it's something that they do, some sick, perverse thing that they do, that if it's a piece of their clothing or their hair or something, to remember the victims, just so that they can relive what they've done with that individual over and over again. So some people study these crimes because they might be involved in, like, maybe law enforcement, and then some people just study the crimes because maybe they do it for law purposes or whatever, or maybe they gotta get in the heads of these people so they can know how to evaluate people who are like this. And then some people are just, they have a particular, maybe they just are good at studying and stuff like this. Maybe this part of their, I don't know, maybe it might be something they're writing about or whatever. But it's crazy because this, I don't know why there were so many. There was, I think on Netflix they were showing, there's the tapes where you can hear him talking, and then they have also the tapes of, they have other people, like other serial killers. So I don't know, maybe it's because of the month of October, I would think. Maybe that they're bringing these things up. It's kind of creepy though. What I thought was creepy was the fact that he was giving the neighbor sandwiches, and she could have been eating one of the victims and not known it. And that was creepy. That was really creepy. You know, like, why would you do something like that? Offer people sandwiches, you know, like, it's disgusting. I would never eat anything out of his house, ever. I wouldn't even want to see anybody like that, but let alone eat something from them. So it just gave you this spine-tingling creepiness, especially even in the movie, him offering sandwiches. It just, it's terrible. But anyway, having said that, there are other articles that are attached to this. I have no idea why, but I guess because this whole thing came up so tough this month about this Jeffrey Dahmer guy. I guess they want you to know about, you know, what happened with his mom or his grandmother that is. And, you know, I think this right here is actually the Jeffrey Dahmer in this, at the bottom. I don't know if you can see what I'm looking at. Maybe you can. But they actually were showing, they do have real footage where you can see some of the court. I think it's on YouTube too, where you can see some of the court drama and the melee that took place, because one of the victim's sisters, she went all out crazy on him. Yeah, so it's pretty horrific. This guy right here, he was eating their bodies, like cannibalism, like what he was doing. And then you have other serial killers that I've heard they would save body parts. I think with Dahmer, he would save body parts. They would be in the refrigerator. He had like a person's head or something of their body part. Ugh, it was just awful. And I think that was partly why his house, where he was, it smelled really bad, because he had, rotting corpses in his refrigerator and in his apartment, and his rooms were like that. And so he just, maybe to him, he didn't smell it, but other people could. And the smell was very strong, smelled like dead people. So I don't understand why the police didn't smell it, when they came close to it. Because if the smell was that strong, don't you think that they would have smelled that same smell and been curious as to go in there and be like, what is that smell, But anyway, having said that, I'm going to let this go. But this is weird. I mean, I don't understand how they could have let him get away with what he did, except, but like what I said, is maybe that the racism was so blatant, and the area where they were at, I believe, the way it's pictured, it's an area where it was primarily black people living in that building, and it probably was known for like not being like a great neighborhood. So probably they just ignored whatever happened over there. They were like, well, we'll come once the damage is done, and that's exactly what they did. And lo and behold, they didn't realize that the people that were living there were telling the absolute truth. They were asking for help, and their calls were ignored for months, and maybe even more than, it was more than months, years, before they actually apprehended this guy. So I've seen this Jeffrey Dahmer character being, people dressing up as him at Universal Studios. I've seen it in theme parks, other various theme parks, and I believe some people don't even think that he really existed. They think he's just a made-up fictional character, that he isn't real. Because, when you don't live in that time period, you don't feel like it's real. You feel like people have made that character up. Like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, people think, oh, those things didn't really happen, and those are true stories. And a lot of times the characters, you'll have like directors, they'll pull from that character and they'll let you see some of the most gruesome, worst things, and it becomes like a Hollywood scare. But people don't realize that these actual situations, at one time, they actually happened. They took place. Like, somebody was posting something about cult leaders and making a joke of it, and turns out that it was real. It wasn't fake, and they thought it was fake, and actual people were still following that cult leader even though that cult leader is dead. And so that's why you have to really read. History is important, and so the way things are now are affected by what happened in the past. And I'm a true believer of that. And a lot of people don't want to, talk about it. But I think talking about it is the first way to know what happened and why things are the way they are, before you can say, oh, this person, blah, 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 is made up. And no, it's not made up. It actually happened. These people really lived. And some of it wasn't that long ago, believe it or not. When you think about it, you're like, wait a minute. My mother was such and such age. That guy was still living. He was still walking around. And so it's like, I don't know. I think it's when people don't know stuff or they don't read anything is when it breeds a lot of ignorance. And so with stuff like this, that's the reason why the victims are coming forward. They're saying all these people see this, they'll see this series and they'll think these characters are made up, or they'll find out the characters existed, but it's not the same. They'll be like, oh no, that couldn't have happened. There'll be people that'll doubt that these people even lived. But just put on YouTube, you'll see the actual court proceedings for this Jeffrey Dahmer guy. He actually lived. He was real. He wasn't fake. It isn't just Netflix making up a character, or he's a Halloween character. And so sometimes when I've gone to theme parks and I've seen people like, like they cringe or whatever, and then they say, oh, he looks scary, but he's not real. Oh, he was real. I think it's scarier when the person, you find out that they actually existed and it isn't something somebody just made up.